All right, guys, this is my third attempt to record this video on aspect as a result of some of the discussions that I read from last week about how Mounce defines aspect. And what I'm finding each time I try to record this is it is a little bit more complicated to explain than what I thought. As I'm trying to explain this, I realize, oh, that's not going to make a lot of sense. So I want to try to give you an understanding of aspect, verbal aspect, that is as simple as possible. And the best way to do that is to start with the aspect that is associated with the present tense. A lot of times the present tense is associated with a progressive aspect. And what progressive means in English, if we use a progressive present or a present progressive, that's going to be things like I am running, I am studying, ongoing action, action that is taking place over time. That's progressive aspect. The opposite of progressive aspect would be perfective aspect. So that would be something that's not viewed as ongoing, but something that's viewed as completed. So if I am studying is progressive aspect, then I have studied would be completed aspect. It's done. The aorist tense in Greek is associated with undefined aspect. And what that means is the action is not portrayed necessarily as ongoing, and it's not portrayed necessarily as completed. It's just sort of a default tense. Now, you might think, since we're learning the present tense first in Greek, that the present tense is sort of the default tense. That's really not the case. There's a different reason why we learn the present tense first. And frankly, it's maybe not a very good reason. The present tense maybe isn't the first tense that we should learn. It's not the most common tense. It's not the most basic tense form-wise. The reason why we learn the present tense first is it's the tense that's closest to the root of the verb, for the most part. But that doesn't mean it's the most basic, and it doesn't mean it's the default tense. The default tense, the vanilla tense in Greek tends to be the aorist tense. Now, that might be surprising because we generally use the English past tense to translate the aorist, even though there are several, I shouldn't say several, there's more than one Greek tense that gets translated with the English past tense. But the idea as far as aspect goes is that the aorist is neither, at least as far as Mounce is concerned, the aorist is neither progressive in its aspect. The action described by an aorist verb is neither, it's not portrayed either as unfolding or as completed. It's simply agnostic. You know, you could think of it as the agnostic aorist. There is no comment from the speaker as to whether the action is ongoing or completed. There's no special emphasis. He could be describing either one. It's just a very bland aspect. That's what Mounce is trying to communicate to you about the aspect of the aorist, as opposed to the more emphasized aspect of the present, which is progressive, it's unfolding, it's duration, action taking place over time, and versus perfective aspect, which would be completed, action that is definite, that has taken place. And so one of the reasons why this is so confusing is because in English, tense is very much tied to time. The present tense is almost always present. The future tense almost always describes an action in the future. The past tense almost always describes an action in the past. Greek is much more flexible. The present tense doesn't necessarily always describe an action taking place right now. The aorist doesn't always describe an action taking place in the past. The future doesn't always describe an action taking place in the future. It's much more flexible with the timing as far as different tenses go. So, bottom line, aorist has to do with how a speaker, sorry, I shouldn't say aorist, aspect, the idea of aspect in Greek has to do with how a speaker or writer is portraying the action unfolding or not unfolding. So if an author uses the present tense, Mounce is trying to say that the author is deliberately portraying that action as taking place over time. So either continuously, repeatedly, duratively, habitually, whatever, action that takes place over time. If an author uses the perfect tense, then he's using perfective aspect, which is completed action. So this is not being portrayed as ongoing action. This is being portrayed as action that has been completed. And then, of course, with the aorist tense, this being the neutral vanilla tense, or neutral vanilla aspect of undefined, the author is simply choosing not to portray the action one way or the other. He's sort of using the default aspect for his action. So aspect is all about how the action is being portrayed by the speaker or being portrayed by the writer. The portrayal of the action is what aspect is about. Aspect is very closely related to another concept called actionsart. And actionsart, let me see if I can, I thought maybe he would, okay, so here, this is an article by Ben Merkel, who's at Southeastern. It was published almost 3 years ago now. Actually, it probably is 3 years ago. If this is, I don't know if .1 is the fall or .1 is the winter, but about 3 years ago in Bulletin for Biblical Research. And he is talking about, he's building on a couple previous articles that had been written. So back in the 70s, Frank Stagg at Southern wrote an article called The Abused Aorist, where he talks about how we have misunderstood what the aorist tense brings to a verb. We have misunderstood it as being a sort of completed aspect, and that's not what the aorist is. The aorist is undefined. It's not completed. And that article, if you're interested, I've got that article here. Well, I guess the publication info isn't. Oh, well, up here I've got, let's see, this was Journal of Biblical Literature, 1972, pages 222 through 231. So if you want to look that up in Joshua, you can easily get access to this article. And so that's basically, this was a very groundbreaking seminal article on the aorist and aspect from about 40 years ago. And then in 2013, David Mathewson from Denver, he writes in Bulletin for Biblical Research, The Abused Present. So now he's applying some of what Stagg said about the aorist and how it's been misused and misunderstood. He's now applying it to the present tense, which is very interesting because what he writes here actually goes against some of what Mounce is saying about the present tense. I would highly recommend that you check. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna email all three of these articles to the class, and at least read this abstract, the very beginning here, so you can see what his main thesis is, and then skim the article if you can. If you're interested in Greek grammar, this is a pretty interesting article, but it is a little bit technical, so I'm not saying you have to read it, but at least read the abstract here, and then maybe skim through and try to familiarize yourself with what he's saying here, because this is a really great article. And then Merkel took those two articles and he's kind of applied what they're saying to aspect in general, and sort of what he's seeing as a pendulum swing a little bit too far in the other direction. So, like I said, I'll email these articles to you guys so that you can learn more about aspect if you want. But what I was saying, aspect is very closely related to another concept called actionsart. And actionsart, this is just a German word that means type of action or sort of action or kind of action. It's related to aspect. It's similar to aspect, but aspect has to do with how the action is portrayed by the speaker or writer. Actionsart is a little bit more objective. Actionsart has a little bit more to do with, for example, run. Just because of what the word run means, it's understood as an ongoing activity. Even if you said, I ran 3 miles, or even if you said, yesterday I ran, that's all you have to say. Frankly, if you just say, he ran, There's very little context there. And we're using a past tense that tends to talk about completed action. In fact, I could say he has run or he had run to make it even more definite, more complete. But just because of what the word run means, just because we understand what action that is describing, we know that the action of run is ongoing. Okay? There are words, there are activities that are progressive inherently. Sing would be another one. Sing is not punctiliar. It's not one point in time. You're not singing really if you just sing one note in an instant. It's not instantaneous. Singing, speaking, these are verbs, these are types of action that are ongoing by nature, just by what they mean. But you can use completed aspect or perfective aspect, rather. You can use progressive aspect to describe these. The reason why this distinction is important is because just because an action is portrayed as completed doesn't mean that the action itself in history was not ongoing. That is to say, just because I say he ran, that doesn't mean that I did it instantaneously. Just because I say he was singing or he sang a song, was singing draws out the continuous idea. He sang a song. I'm portraying that as just sort of simple, undefined aspect. I'm not telling you that it was punctiliar. I'm not telling you that it was progressive. I'm just telling you, just as a brute fact, it happened. He did sing a song. The actionsart is obviously going to be progressive or continuous because that's the type of action that singing is. So actionsart is much more tied to meaning, the meaning of a verb or the meaning of an action, a word, whereas aspect has to do with portrayal. So that's what I really want you to understand about verbal aspect. Verbal aspect has to do with how a speaker or writer is portraying action, not necessarily what actually happened in the past. So one reason why this is important, and this is something that Stagg touches on in The Abused Aorist, I'm not going to find it very quickly, but people used to, German isn't going to help you very much here. Let's see. Okay. A.N. Wilder falls into the aoristic trap in his interpretation of 1 John 2:1. But if anyone does sin, i.e., commits an act of sin, aorist tense, contrast habitual sin in the present tense. So what's happening is this guy Wilder is drawing a distinction in 1 John between one-time sin versus continual sin in the present tense. How many of you have heard this contrast in 1 John about there's this continual sin which is different from one-time sin? He says, John may imply a distinction between a single act of sin and habitual sin, but the aorist tense does not require this. It permits it. What we don't want to do is say because he's using the aorist here, it can't be continuous. That is not what the aorist does. The aorist is not the opposite of the present tense. The aorist is the, you might say, I don't want to say unmarked, but it's the vanilla, it's the default, where the present tense adds a special emphasis. Aorist is not the opposite of present. If present is progressive, aorist is not the opposite of that, which would be like punctiliar, punctuated, single, instantaneous. Aorist is simply undefined. So what he's really pointing out here is don't fall into the trap of thinking that aorist necessarily means that an action is a one-time occurrence. R.H. Charles falls into the same aoristic trap in his comment on Revelation 4:11, were then by one definite act created. Okay, he's saying that because it's aorist, because created is aorist